Hey, today we discuss the variations of severity of the fear emotion, the overwhelming evidence that our new definition of fear is actually accurate, and we start the voyage into your personal catalysts of fear. Let's go. Welcome to the I Am podcast presentation of A Master's Class on Fear, Part 3. I am your presenter, Sean Webb. So last class we presented the new, irrefutable definition of fear as the biochemical reaction to a potential devaluation of a cognitive attachment of the mind. What? Or more plainly put, we explained that when an idea that you are attached to falls into jeopardy, fear is the result. And we discussed how this definition actually solves a 4,000-year-old mystery of psychology regarding the exact components within the mind that cause people to experience fear. But we didn't fully cover how the different attachment levels and realities as perceived are directly proportional to the amount of fear that someone experiences, nor did we cover enough examples to ensure that our definition is rock solid, because frankly, I'm going to put a $10,000 reward out for the first person who can prove this new definition of fear wrong. So let's cover the details. First, let's look at how the details within the equation of emotion affect your fear response and create the multiple variations of severity of fear. If you remember, the equation of emotion is expectation or preference as compared to reality as perceived, and that results in some sort of emotional response if both of those things exist. And in the case of fear, when the EP, expectation or preference, has something to do with the valuation of an attachment of the ego, and a perceived reality is present as a threat of that valuation, fear occurs. But what variation or level of fear depends on two things. First, there's the attachment level of the thing being threatened, like we talked about in part 2. For instance, if you're very attached to grandma and she has a heart attack, your fear of losing her is substantial, partly because of your strong attachment to her. If, however, grandma lived in Germany all your life and you never actually met her and everyone told you she was a mean and nasty person, your fear of losing her would be less acute. A mild concern might surface, if that. But when your mind is determining the level of fear response, the other side of the equation of emotion comes into play also. Reality as it is perceived. This has to do with the threat itself. In the case of grandma having a heart attack, the heart attack is a pretty serious life threat and can be a symptom of other major issues, so your perception of the threat level is substantial, so depending on your connection level to grandma, you can feed this into a higher level of fear. But in an alternative scenario that threatens the life of your grandma, maybe she has a very badly infected ingrown toenail. If left unchecked, it certainly could kill her, but in the event that she's taking antibiotics, then probably everything will be fine. You have a lower level of fear. You have concern for grandma maybe, but you're not panicked that she is about to die. And the difference between those two scenarios is the reality as you perceive it. On that tack, if a bear was charging across your lawn towards your child, your level of fear would be to the severity that a release of adrenaline would occur, and you'd be moved into a mode of unthinking accelerated action. If, however, you were watching someone in a bear costume running across the lawn toward your child, your level of fear would be less due to the reduced perception of the threat. So both sides of the equation come into play. Your attachment level to the thing being threatened and your reality as you are perceiving it. Now, moving a little forward in our understanding, here is the severity variation chart of fear. As you can see, it actually helps us define 5 separate human emotions as defined by modern psychology, all within the fear family. When you have something of high power on the EP side in regard to an attachment of your mind, and then your perception of reality presents a higher level threat to that attachment, a high level of fear occurs, possibly even a panic type response. However, if there's a low level of attachment to the thing being threatened, or the perception of the threat is low to something that you're very attached to, a low level of fear occurs, maybe a mild concern. So now, to prove out the base definition and drive this lesson home with some examples, let's look at some of the top 10 most common fears on the planet, and then we'll move into some specific fears that many of us experience and explain those comprehensively as well, so that we can start to see in really concrete examples how fear manifests within us. Some of the top 10 fears globally include things like fear of heights, a fear of water, fear of tunnels and bridges, fear of needles, fear of examination, fear of illness, fear of death, fear of social rejection, fear of failure, fear of public speaking, fear of ghosts and evil powers, fear of things like spiders, snakes, and creepy crawly things. And the statistics are that it doesn't matter where we're born on the planet, doesn't matter what social conditioning we receive, doesn't matter who teaches us about life as we grow up, we are naturally predisposed to be fearful about one or many of those things. And so moving right into the list. A fear of heights isn't really a fear of heights, it's a person's reaction to a perceived threat of falling and what that fall could do to the body, something which the mind is very attached to as the sense of self. But in someone who has conquered this fear, they can walk around on the closed observation deck of the Sears Tower all day long as the building actually sways in the winds of Lake Michigan, knowing that the thick glass up there is probably going to keep them from falling. So the reality as perceived by that person is that the threat is less valid, therefore they experience less fear. In someone who's freaking out and they can't approach the glass at all, they're not taking the safety features of the glass into consideration, so their reality as perceived is different, and therefore their fear is greater. Next, a fear of bodies of water is the same thing as fear of heights, basically. Water, if deep enough, flowing fast enough, cold enough, etc., provides a threat to the body, which is a central attachment of the mind's definition of identity. And in someone who doesn't know how to swim, their perception of the threat of falling in is much higher than in someone who does know how to swim and is comfortable in the water, and so explains the subjectivity of a fear about open water. The fear of tunnels and bridges, same thing. It isn't the fear of the man-made device itself, but the reaction to a potential failure and collapse of the thing while you are in it or on it. Either of those potentials pose a threat to the body, which is the mind's main attachment of identity, and in someone whose imagination makes it easy for them to see a collapse, they have a higher fear level than in someone who sees the tunnel or bridge as an engineering marvel that will probably be in place for hundreds of years. The fear of needles is specifically a reaction to the breach of the skin, and just like the cells can communicate to us when they're hungry, when they want rest, when they want sex, there within us also seems to be a natural message that things poking holes in us to let in pathogens is not a good idea. And of course, with the same reasoning, it's very easy to understand the fear of illness and the fear of death and the fear of injury. All those create a threat of non-body continuation, and the perceived reality of that threat, of course, comes into play here. The potential for a car to hit you as it's sliding towards you creates a different threat perception than the chances the moon is suddenly going to drop on your head. And so you have a different level of fear as the result of those two situations. Now, all those being very similar and easy to explain, it's at the fear of examination that allows us to start bridging out away from the mind's attachment to the body into the mind's connection to other cognitive ideas of self. Certainly a medical examination would be an opportunity to find threat to the body, but fear is also felt by school students when examinations come in the form of tests and quizzes. So what's going on there? Well, attachments within the mind can include how a student looks upon their grades as a reflection of their intelligence, or their ability to learn, or their discipline to study the material, all of which society attaches to perceived self-worth. So what's at stake when an A or an F is handed out isn't just a letter grade, but a validation or an attack on a student's very perception of self in regard to their intelligence or capability as a student. And if that student's score causes a perception of others to see that student differently than the student sees themselves, there is a definite threat to an idea of self there. And thus, the fear response occurs in some students when it's test time. Because for students who don't give a shit about how they're seen as a student, or don't connect the letter grade of the class onto their sense of self or their sense of accomplishment, they don't fear the test. They don't care. And our same model holds true for fears like that of social rejection. The mind attaches to ideas of self-value, and acceptance of others is evidence that you're okay, that your existence is valued within society. If an instance of social rejection occurs, however, that's a situation where the mind's perception of self is devalued, where all of a sudden we're not okay, we're not accepted as is, and thus fear is the innate response to that potential devaluation being a possibility. If I'm rejected, I am less. It's a potential attack on the attachment of the mind regarding the perception of self. Contrarily, and true to the model, if your reality as is perceived is that you don't care as much about what people think about you, you're less concerned with social rejection. If you get your sense of self from what others think, oh my God, what are people going to think when that happens? You can live your entire life in fear of everything that you do or everything that could happen. The fear of public speaking. The potential threat comes in the form of questions like, How stupid am I going to look if I screw this up? How unintelligent am I going to seem if I can't read this fluidly? How are people going to judge me when they see my love handles as I make this speech? For people like me, who don't care what you think about my ideas or my extra fat, I speak confidently knowing this is going to be seen by hundreds of thousands of people eventually, and I do so without giving a flip. That is my reality as it's perceived, affecting my level of fear to 0. The fears of ghosts and evil spirits is a reaction to the thought, what can they do to me? Can they kill me? Can they possess me? Can they hurt me or my family? All fears connected with the potential devaluation of a sense of self. If you don't believe in ghosts and evil spirit, your reality as it's perceived takes away all the fear at Halloween. Fear of spiders and snakes and other creepy crawlies may partially be an evolutionary development that teaches us to stay away from poisonous things, but we also can't rule out the possibility of it also being a reaction to the cognitive mind saying, ooh, hey, that thing has 8 legs where I have only 2 and it moves really fast. Can it hurt me? Look how fast that snake can move without any arms and legs. Am I in danger? Again, it fits. And if you've gotten over your fear of spiders or snakes by learning about them or how to handle them, you adjust your reality as it's perceived, and that allows you to feel less fear as a result. But let's move beyond the top 10 fears and look at a couple more complex fears that we experience in our everyday lives. Okay, so let's say you're in a shitty relationship. And you know there's probably something better out there for you, but you're not sure enough that you're ready to pull the trigger on ending your current thing. Well, that's fear rearing its ugly head. For many of us, our sense of self is connected with who we're with, relationship-wise. I'm so-and-so's significant other. So there's the attachment to so-and-so, and there's the attachment to the relationship status itself becoming a part of your world, and all the attachment to what both of those mean to you in your mind. And then for some of us, our value of self is connected with the ability to be loved, i.e. I'm in a relationship, which is proof someone loves me. And or for some of us, our comfort of self resides in a connection we have with our friends who are in a similar relationship status, i.e. my friendship with so-and-so is closer when we can bitch about our significant others together. And or maybe your sense of self is connected with what society or your family says your relationship status should be, i.e. I'm supposed to have a significant other because I am expected to. And all those attachments and the fear of loss of those attachments, the fear of devaluation, can keep you in a shitty relationship. Because whatever those attachments are in your mind connected with that shitty relationship, regardless of how shitty it is, there is a threat to the mind's sense of self when you start talking about ending it. Who will I be with when I'm single? Will I ever be loved again? How will I relate to my relationship-committed friends? How will the kids react to me and or the end of the relationship? How will my parents or other family members react? And all these things are fears, all connected with your sense of self and the potential devaluation that you could receive as a result of the action. Your perception of these issues, your RP, can adjust your fear. If you care about those things, then your fear is higher and you delay ending the bad relationship longer. If you don't give a flip about those things, you don't care what other people think, and your happiness is what you care about the most, you end it sooner than later because you're less fearful about the change. Let's take a current event example. Let's say you're fearful about losing your job. Well, if you are, it's because your mind attaches to your job as your sense of self. In addition, there's an attachment to the idea that society tells us we're supposed to be productive, beneficial members of society and that we're supposed to have a job and be working. And then there's the threat of losing that status. And then there's also the attachments that money brings into your mind and what that means to you and your ability to pay the bills and how that affects your sense of self. So if you think about it, there's a lot of you, or at least your mind's perception of you, that's at risk if you lose your job. And the more you're attached to those ideas and the more real you perceive the threat, like your company's already announced layoffs, the more fear you might feel. Incidentally, my friend, Mark, just lost his job a little while ago, and now he's continually finding excuses not to apply to new ones because of his fear that each rejection means to his understanding of his existence. He feels that it's an attack on him every time he gets a rejection, and so he's afraid to apply for a job. Sorry, Mark, but you know I'm right. So let's look at one more quick real-life story from this last weekend. I saw my 2-year-old son experience fear just this last weekend when we were hiking out near the lake. We stopped along the lakeshore where he started throwing pebbles out into the water, right? Watching the ripples. And so when he was occupied with picking up a pebble, Daddy picked up a short piece of thick tree branch and threw it about 20 feet out into the water without a warning. Kasploosh! I thought this might be a fun little surprise for him, but Declan immediately looked up in fear of the large splash and took 4 steps backward rather quickly. And he was just about to start into tears flowing when I explained that it was Daddy that threw a stick out into the water, and then I threw another one to show him. And only then did the big splashes become a new game that we could play. So was that fear of the unfamiliar large splash something that he learned from Mommy or Daddy, as today's psychology would suggest? Absolutely not. In fact, we encourage Declan to be bold in new environments and with new experiences, as we are, so you can't even make an argument that we transfer tentative or cautious feelings to him in these types of situations. So we can throw that understanding of existence of fear right out the window. The reality was that he experienced something with which he was not familiar, and which could potentially be a threat to his sense of self, his body. Something bigger than him could be making that splash. His expectation or preference, of course, was that a big unknown splash not occur when he's standing right at the water's edge. And when it did occur, it created an uncertain reality as perceived, RP, regarding a potential threat to him. And so fear occurred within him as a natural result, to a decently high level, I might add. And he was on his way to a meltdown. But just then, Daddy stepped in. And I adjusted his RP, his reality as is perceived. I showed him another big branch and chucked it out into the lake, showing him where the first splash came from, just as I showed him the second splash, and showing him it was no big deal. And so now his RP was shifted, knowing the splash not to be that of a threat, and we even turned it into a game. The result was that after that, fear was expressed much less acutely in my 2-year-old boy, as perfectly expressed by our new model of understanding human emotions. And this model, ladies and gentlemen, works to define fear every time in every human, and we're going to put a $10,000 challenge on finding one example where it doesn't. But sticking to our master's class on fear for a moment, now that we know the nuances of exactly how fear works in the human mind, how can we tweak our minds to reduce the amount of fear that we experience in our lives and reduce the negative effects that fear brings to our lives? Well, that's exactly what we're going to talk about in part 4 of the I Am Podcast's Master's Class on Fear. Please, do not hesitate to share this free information with your family and friends and those which you love, because I'm hoping that this will be able to help you guys get a better grasp on fear in your own lives. For the I Am Podcast's Master's Class on Fear, I'm Sean Webb.